Hello and welcome to this lesson on quantitative research validity. The lesson should provide a basis for you to be able to evaluate the quality of quantitative educational health sciences research. The general validity question for quantitative research is, are the conclusions of a study supported? And there are 5 criteria that we use to answer this basic question. I want to spend a short amount of time on the 3 highlighted criteria on this slide because these are concepts that will be touched on in more detail later. In the case of measurement validity, there's an entire chapter dedicated to it in the book. And in the case of statistical conclusion validity, it's something that you probably need to take a whole course on to really get a sense of. With respect to face validity, the text doesn't really talk about this one, so I wanted to mention it because you may come across it in conversations on research as you become more exposed to research in general. So face validity refers to the question of whether the research generally flows well and is aligned from start to finish. In other words, do you get a sense from reading the research that the literature review justifies the research questions, that the methods appear appropriate to answer those questions, and that the conclusions are supported by the results? If you read an article and start to question the alignment from research questions to methods to results, and then finally conclusions, the work is starting to lack face validity. Now, measurement validity or construct validity is sometimes the only validity that seems to matter in much of the health sciences educational research that you'll read. This type of validity is often conflated with the entire concept of research validity and can cause researchers to not even address the other criteria at all. And although it's discussed a lot, it's usually discussed in a very superficial way, focusing on things like reliability or just general statements about validation. Now, the general question with measurement validity is, are the scores from an instrument able to be used for their intended purpose? And this requires answering a lot of questions, like, are there questions in the instrument itself indicators of the intended concept? Are the scores that you get out of the instrument reliable? And is there evidence that the scores correlate or don't correlate the way you expect them to? Next, statistical conclusion validity is about evaluating assumptions that are needed to be met in order to run any statistical tests. So again, you likely need to take classes to be able to fully evaluate this type of concern, but there are some common things to consider when reading research and evaluating it for statistical conclusion validity. One is the idea of whether or not the authors discuss tests of assumptions that are needed in order to be able to use the analytic techniques that they've employed. Another thing to look for are things like small sample sizes or running multiple individual statistical tests without mentioning anything about adjustments being made to avoid type 1 or type 2 errors. So next I want to talk about the 2 big ones in quantitative research validity, internal and external validity. So evaluating internal validity is about assessing whether the study design leaves open alternative explanation for any observed relationships between independent and dependent variables. The general question is, does the research design control for confounding variables that may provide different explanations for the conclusions of a study? If a research design involves manipulation of an independent variable, random assignment, and a comparison/control group, then it's a true experiment. And all of these threats have been controlled for. So threats to internal validity become irrelevant. But assessing for threats to internal validity is very relevant in an educational setting where we often cannot do true experiments and are left with doing more quasi-experimental research. One of the most common quantitative research designs in education is the single group pre-post test design. In this quasi-experimental design, there's no comparison group or control group to ensure all alternative explanations have been ruled out. So you've got a pre-test, an intervention, and then a post-test. The most common threats to this type of design are the ones that are highlighted: history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, and regression threat. So history threat has to do with the fact that depending on the level of laboratory control, so the research control, participants may have experiences other than the intervention or treatment that can ultimately influence the outcome. So consider a study where students are assessed on their critical thinking skills at the start of a class. When they're exposed to a specific critical thinking intervention and are reassessed on their critical thinking skills at the end of the class. Now, during the term, those same students were taking the same three other classes, and those three other classes involved non-explicit but related education on critical thinking. So as a result, any observed change from pre to post could be due to the other experiences, or at least partially due to the other experiences that the students had outside of the class that was a subject of the study. Now, maturation threat is very similar, but instead of having shared experiences in other classes outside of a study, you're simply maturing in a way that's related to the outcome of interest in a similar way across all participants. Critical thinking is a good example again here because, especially for younger kids who experience general biological and cognitive maturation that are related to critical thinking. Now, this type of threat is likely more relevant for long delays between pre and post test assessment, but it should be commented on if relevant. Testing threat is the idea that simply being tested can result in learning, which may show up on the post test. So especially if the outcome is learning, that you're assessing how much learning has happened, and the test questions don't change, then when you expose the participants on the pre-test, it might actually be part of what helps them to learn how to do better on the post-test. Instrumentation threat is something to be aware of when the researcher uses different instruments at pre and post. So now you've got a situation where they've tried to control for testing threat, but they've introduced something else. If they don't take steps to ensure that the instruments are equivalent in terms of, say, their difficulty or their coverage of the topic, then any observed change could be due to differences in the instruments themselves rather than the intervention that was introduced. And regression threat, the final one for single group designs. This is one that relates to instruments as well. And it's about the situation where participants might score at the very extreme high end or extreme low end of an instrument. So get very low scores close to zero or very high scores close to the top end. And what's happening here is that because the way we measure involves error, there is a good chance that the scores will actually move closer to the mean upon repeated measurement, just due to the fact that there was error in the measurement itself. So if you see scores on instruments in a research study clustering at the tails, that high end or that low end, then you should be concerned about potential regression threat that could confound observed results. Now, the last threat to talk about from an internal validity perspective is differential selection threat. Now, this is for multiple group designs. So differential selection is a concern for research designs with multiple groups, but that do not involve random assignment. This is again pretty common in education because researchers are often dealing with pre-existing groups, so kids in a classroom. Now, without random assignment, participants in one group might differ on any number of variables that could ultimately impact how an intervention will affect the participants. As a result, this could give rise again to several alternative explanations for any observed differences in the groups at post-test. So researchers should speculate on variables that would be important to ensure that there are no pre-existing differences on. Then they should measure them and in some cases control for them in their analysis, which you'll often see in some of the quantitative research you'll read. So if you see things like researchers controlling for demographics, that's them signaling to you that they're attempting to address some aspects of differential selection. Okay, so external validity is about the general question of whether study findings will generalize across variations in different characteristics of a study design. Now, most researchers limit this discussion to things about whether samples in a study are representative of a target population. But there's so much more to it than this. Population threat is also about whether study findings will generalize to specific subgroups of a target population. So you may have a sample, and you find some interesting result, but is there a subgroup within that target population for which those results might not apply? Ecological threats are about whether results will generalize outside of a very controlled research environment. Now, this is relevant in educational research because some of the stuff we do is more theoretical or more controlled and done in a lab setting, where we control for the complexities of educational contexts, which leaves open the question, will those findings from that type of a study actually hold up in a more real-world setting? So if you have questions about that and they aren't addressed in the discussion section of a research paper, then you may be questioning the external validity and specifically the ecological validity of the study. Temporal threat is really just about whether the study findings will stand the test of time. And there's been many studies across the educational field and other fields that have stood the test of time and many that haven't. So the question is, are the findings you're reading about now, maybe from a 20 to 30-year-old study, something you can trust to hold up currently? Treatment variation threat is about whether results will generalize across slightly different versions of an intervention. So educational interventions are often, modified slightly or given an educator's, specific flavor. And so the question is, will those slight modifications, will the results of a study hold up to that? It's not really anything to be too concerned about, but it's something that, is worth discussing in terms of the robustness of the results of a study. Outcome threat is about whether results will generalize across different measures of a dependent variable. So I can measure critical thinking with all kinds of different instruments. And the question is, will the results of a study hold up to the different ways that we might measure the dependent variable? So that's been the lesson on quantitative research validity. Take care.